Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Chris Hatherley. I'm the CEO of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia, and it's absolutely delightful to be here in person. Isn't this wonderful? So thank you all for coming along. Thank you also. We've got a number of people who are watching this as a live broadcast. So this is the first time we've gone into the live broadcasting territory, but really pleased that people from all over the country are able to watch this launch of a fantastic book, particularly those who contributed to the workshop and to the content of the book, but due to various travel restrictions weren't able to be here today. Just a few housekeeping bits and pieces. Obviously, if you could please put your phones onto silent, but do keep them on, and if you're in social media, feel free to tweet, share information about the book and tag both the Academy and the ANU Press, or ANU Info and the University of Canberra as well. If there is an alarm, the exits are straightforward, straight out the door here in an orderly fashion, and the bathrooms are down the stairs and into the library. The live broadcast is focusing on the speaker here, so please do feel free to keep on eating and enjoying your drinks for those who are here. It's all fine. Now, the other thing I'm pleased to be able to announce today is the premiere of a new Acknowledgement of Country video the Academy has put together. It was finished just yesterday, so I'll stop here and I will start that video.
Wherever you are across Australia,
we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this land.
The Darug peoples.
The Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
The Gundungurra people of the Southern Highlands.
The Ngunnawal people of the Canberra region on whose country we are standing.
And all other peoples of this vast continent.
Their ongoing connection through custodianship of its land and waters.
Physical and spiritual.
Through culture, language and ceremony.
Where sovereignty was never ceded. We pay our respects to elders past, present and still to come.
So that was some of that was filmed just yesterday morning, the footage of the lake and the National Library where we are here this afternoon. So I also pay my respect to the traditional owners of the land we're on here at present in Canberra, and to elders past, present and future. Now I'm going to introduce one of the editors of Morrison's Miracle, Anika Gauja, and she's going to take us through the proceedings this afternoon. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris, and I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders, past and present, and custodians of the land that we are gathered on today. I'd like to welcome everybody here to this entirely COVID-compliant launch of Morrison's Miracle, and a very big welcome to those joining us online. If you can't be with us online, you just have to picture the room. Everyone is seated, and it's very much like a National Press Club event. It's going to be the only opportunity I have to speak at a faux National Press Club, so I'm just going to pretend that it is. I'd like to welcome everybody on behalf of the editorial team, myself, Marian Sims, and the many contributors to this volume, Morrison's Miracle, which is the 17th edition of our election book series. It's an important edition for a number of reasons. Circumstances in which it's been published are obviously very, very extraordinary. And as Chris mentioned, it's the first time that we're doing a launch, both in person and online. And I think this is very interesting because it exemplifies the way in which the book and the series itself has been evolving over time. It's always been a hallmark of rigorous academic analysis and tradition of in-depth analysis and debate post the election. So that academic rigour continues. But what we've tried to do in more recent editions of the book is to really make the book accessible and the work of the political science community in Australia accessible to a more general audience throughout Australia and throughout the world. And Morrison's Miracle and the past few books in the election series have been incredibly successful in that regard. So with Morrison's Miracle, we've had a fantastic response on social media and on the internet, with news of the book reaching over 26,000 people on Facebook and LinkedIn, same numbers on Twitter. And in terms of the book's reach itself, Abbott's Gambit and Double Disillusion, the two previous books, have been downloaded each over 32,000 times. Morrison's Miracle is on track to meet those figures as well. It was only published less than a month ago, and already it's been downloaded almost 3,000 times. So that's a huge testament to the quality of the work, and I think a real acknowledgement for the contributors for their fantastic efforts, and the way in which the book, the community behind it and the scholars involved seek to create a sort of a more engaged notion of political science research for Australia and the community. So I'd like to just briefly talk you through how this afternoon is going to happen. I'll introduce Marian who will then, it's a tag team of introductions, introduce Mark Kenny to officially launch the book, and then we'll return to Marian Sims to thank many of the key people that need to be thanked. So over to you, Marian.
Thank you. As Anika said, Marian Sims is responsible for most of the thank yous at the end of this little presentation, but I would like to just acknowledge one person, it's Roxanne Missingham, who played an important role in ensuring that the publication subsidy committee of the ANU did support the publication of our book. Thank you, Roxanne. Now, Mark Kenny. It's such a pleasure to introduce Mark Kenny, who's going to launch the book. As you all know, Mark's had a very distinguished career in journalism with the ABC, with News Corp and with Fairfax, as National Affairs Editor for The Age, Sydney Morning Herald and Canberra Times. Mark's known for his very thoughtful commentary on public affairs and for his understanding of gender issues, and this is much appreciated by the editors. We have got used to seeing Mark on The Insiders, and he's very well known for his presentations on The Insiders. But now he's come to the ANU, which we're of course very pleased about. He's a professor in the Australian Studies Institute of the ANU, Aussie, I'm afraid it's called. and Mark is responsible for wonderful Democracy Sausage podcasts, which you should catch up with if you haven't done so already. So, without any more ado, please join with me in welcoming Mark.
Thank you, Marian. That was terrific, and I hope I can come close to living up to that billing. And I should say, just by way of acknowledgement, and I certainly mirror the acknowledgements that have already been given to country, let me put that on the record. But can I also acknowledge my Democracy Sausage partner, Maria Tafaga, who's also with us today, who sits through the podcast and makes such a valuable contribution to that. And it's just such a great pleasure to be working with her and with so many people in this room. Sometimes a political phenomenon can be both easily observable and yet overlooked. I remember noticing this in 2008 as Hillary Clinton sought the Democratic nomination against Barack Obama, who you remember was quite a newbie at the time. It occurred to me that her elevation, and she was the favoured candidate, would probably result in the leadership of the mightiest democracy in history being handed back and forth between just two families for near enough to 3 decades. This alone might have been enough reason not to do it, and perhaps it was a factor for some Democrats. The familial duopoly had started with George Herbert Walker Bush in 1988 and continued right through 2 Bill Clinton terms to 2000, and then another 2 by George W. Bush Jr. ending in 2008. That's 20 years right there. Now, you'd think with 320 million people in America, they might be able to find someone else. It's reasonable, I think, to argue that Hillary Clinton would have won in 2008 and that she would have secured the 2 terms that were served by President Barack Obama to 2016. Now, that would have made 28 years of Bush and Clintons. At the risk of labouring the point, Bush Sr. had been VP since 1980 under Ronald Reagan, so he'd actually been in and around the White House for 8 years even before taking over. And of course, Hillary Clinton had been First Lady during her husband's 2 terms. This obsession with inness, this feeling that the only people fit to lead had to be long-term Washington insiders, is at odds with what has happened since, and perhaps causally so, in that it may explain the attraction of a true outsider in the form of Donald Trump in 2016. Still, one can marvel at the things American voters will suspend, colossal personal faults and even their own racism, just to avoid putting a woman in the White House. While the gender issue was central in that election, and I certainly don't wish to downplay it, it is also likely that many American voters flocked to Trump precisely because he was not experienced. This is a not uncommon paradox of populism, the angry embrace of what to institutional mainstreamers feels like dangerous amateurism and flaky incompetence. The amazing thing about this is that it's still true of the president today seeking his 2nd term. Trump's signature failure is his belligerent refusal to learn to grow in the job, to become encultured by the panoramic responsibilities of national leadership and its venerable mediating institutions. Which brings me to an Australian factoid that is both easily observable and yet still remarkable when you stop to think about it. It too tells us something about decay and dysfunction in our democratic machinery. And it's this: Scott Morrison is the first new Australian Prime Minister since the 1990s to be allowed to grow in the job, the first to be given the room to fail in order that he might succeed. And this is no trick statistic. Morrison is actually the 6th PM as we begin the 3rd decade of the new millennium, or the 7th if you count Rudd twice, which you could conceivably do. I'm sure he would. And yet, you have to go back to John Howard, elected in 1996, for the last time a PM won an election and then made it through a full term, that is, won an election for the first time, and then made it through a full term to contest that 2nd election, let alone win it. And bear in mind, Morrison hasn't done it yet. Like Rudd, Gillard, Abbott and Turnbull, Morrison so far has merely won that first election. However, it's fair to say that he will not face a challenge before the next election, and at this stage, I think remains well placed to contest it. Obviously, Howard went on to do that twice more in the 2000s by winning in 2001 and 2004. But the important point is that his first term from March 1996 to October 1998 was marked by a series of scandals, resignations, unpopular policy decisions, and yet his party stuck with him. And as we know, so too eventually did Australians. Yes, Kim Beazley's opposition won the popular vote in 1998, but the coalition retained enough seats to squeeze through into what became a dozen years with Howard at the helm. This, as an aside, confirmed another strong tendency in Australian federal elections, which is that first-term governments are both vulnerable and safe at the same time. That is, they are routinely almost tossed out, yet not quite. While the circumstances always differ, a common theme is that they are weighed down by mistakes, the same mistakes that inevitably come with inexperience, and yet they are usually able to overcome these negatives with the cumulative positives that come with incumbency. Things like the timing of the election itself, which they can set to their own advantage, the allocation of spending to sway groups and marginal seats, the louder megaphone of government, and the implied prestige and accumulating expertise that comes with simply being in power. In short, if you're a first-term opposition, the the best chance you might have of recovering the Treasury benches is at the new government's first return to the people. Despite the 2007 mudslide, as it was called, and for reasons we all well know about, Abbott came perilously close in 2010, and thanks to Labor's internecine warfare, Labor blew itself out of contention in the 2013 race. Abbott bombed home, and yet it turned out that Bill Shorten would have his best chance of becoming Prime Minister at the very next election in 2016, again after just one, albeit calamitous, coalition term. Turnbull's near-death experience, of course he'd become the Prime Minister by then, in 2016, was arguably his own version of this tendency when he waited too long to seek the voters' imprimatur after toppling the quixotic Abbott. This era of waiting gave him time to begin really disappointing voters who'd initially been delighted with his ascension to the top job. It gave him time also to pack in some notable failures, like an ill-fated tax reform kerfuffle that came and went, achieving nothing. The Coalition's dismal 2016 results sealed Turnbull's fate, even though it took his critics another 2 years to finally kill him off. All of which brings us to Scotty from marketing, as his critics like to call him. Liberals went to Morrison largely because of the two things he was not. He was not Turnbull and he was not Abbott. Peter Dutton, they reasoned, who was the other person in the race by then, was an Abbott derivative, a hardliner who could not appeal to a broad electorate. For his part, Turnbull argues they rolled him as leader singularly because he would win in 2019, or at least might win. Now, this version of events seems typically self-serving, and not just of Malcolm Turnbull. I think all Prime Ministers have these sort of delusions about, or these versions of events that have them at the centre. But Turnbull's theory is not without some substance. Armed with the very news poll numbers Turnbull had relied on to topple Abbott, Turnbull critics were able to mount a credible case that he was leading them to defeat. This was the minimum cover they needed in order to start tearing him down. But it seems likely that they also feared he might recover in the polls and might even win the next election. This is a reasonable deduction, if only because from the moment Morrison took over, there was a widespread acceptance within the party room that the next election was already a write-off. The clear expectation was that the transaction cost of dumping Turnbull and the low likeability of the man who replaced him meant 2019 was probably beyond their reach. Think about that for a moment. They dumped a broadly popular PM they were unsure would lose in favour of his untried, untested and unpopular treasurer who they felt certain could not win. Turnbull may overplay this point somewhat, but he is, in my view, at least partially right. Such was their determination to be rid of him that they were prepared to pay the cost at the ballot box. Yet, of course, funnily enough, they were actually wrong, as this wonderful book, Morrison's Miracle, explains. ScoMo did in fact win in May 2019 in a come-from-behind, lone hand triumph of suburban virtue. Well, that's the folklore anyway. Success has many fathers, but the immediate aftermath of the 29 upset win, it served Liberals to name Scott Morrison as victory's lone paterfamilias. Morrison had snatched victory from the jaws of defeat per force of nothing more than his own hard work, unshakable self-belief, deeply held religious faith, and a preternatural sense of personal destiny. Happily, Morrison's Miracle, this book, is on hand to skewer such simplicities. Its editors, Anika Gauja, Marian and Marian Sims, have produced a brilliant, wide-ranging book that gives both scholars and the interested reader the context needed to understand what happened and why. Setting the scene, the editors canvass Morris's unique Pentecostalism, the background conditions of low trust in politicians and media, the corrosive impact of fake news, the charge so ubiquitous now in our discourse, and the insidious influence of populist minor parties, mainly on the right. Also noteworthy is Clive Palmer's extraordinary $80 million, I've got billion here, but $80 million advertising blitz, and we read he's gearing up for another go in the forthcoming Queensland state election. Plus, of course, there's the influence the parties of the right have begun to exercise via social media platforms such as Facebook. As the editors point out, the Liberal Party's social media strategy gained more than twice the number of views than Labor's in 2019, which was a reversal of the 2 elections previous. Ultimately, they conclude, correctly in my view, that the election result was, quote, overdetermined. In other words, any one of a number of causes might have been sufficient to account for it. This, of course, is true, and it is always true. Did Howard lose the election in 2007 over work choices? Or was it the NBN? Or climate change? Or Kevin Rudd's bold plan to spend less as a self-proclaimed fiscal conservative? For some individuals, it was all of these, and for others, just one. I remember somewhat cheekily branding Rudd as future boy in the election's aftermath, as I sought to explain the trick he'd pulled off, which, to my mind, involved him presenting as a kind of Howard for the future, as if the real one was already consigned to the past. Nothing more dramatic than trading in your Kingswood for a Commodore with Bluetooth connectivity. Rudd's lay preacher looks and churchy morals allowed him to reassure the electorate that far from being a threat, he was merely John Howard 2.0, an update who believed in climate change and understood the internet. This gave voters permission to switch without feeling like they were taking a risk or betraying their own past judgments. In her chapter titled Ideology and Populism, Carol Johnson, under whom I was lucky enough to study, frames the election as this election, the one we've just had, as one of competing left-wing and right-wing populisms. On the left, Labor sought to mobilise against a them, which was the big end of town, which we heard so much about, which she notes is presented as a predatory enemy of the ordinary people. On the right, the coalition also owns the ordinary by seeking to mobilise people against big government, which is coming for your savings, your earnings, your homes. Notable here several authors note the personalisation of the electoral contest and how that played out. Notable here are Paul Strangio and James Walder in their chapter, The Personalisation of the Campaign. They write that Morrison was able to use his obscurity as an advantage, allowing him to construct an identity in the election contest, whereas Shorten was lumbered with the image he already had, which was so firmly established. Again, I find this compelling, and yet Morrison's effective rebranding is hardly surprising, coming from a politician whose background is marketing. Self-evidently, the coalition turned its weaknesses into a strength, and Labor's strengths, its sudden stability in sticking with Shorten and its extensive policy agenda, into weakness. The perfect encapsulation of this was the slogan, "The bill you can't afford," which wrapped anxiety about higher taxes with antipathy for a Labor leader seen as shifty and untrustworthy. The cut-through of this slogan is also examined by Andrea Carson and Laurie Zion when they look at the media as a frame of reference, noting that even if Labor was not as disadvantaged by negative coverage as it might claim, the very selection of stories and angles covered by newspapers more often aligned with the coalition's strategic direction. And I'd single out the Australian here just for an honourable mention. I can't think of a single front page that was even remotely neutral, let alone favourable to the Labor Party. Nicholas Barry, in his chapter on the Liberal Party, concisely describes this achievement. Quote, "Despite the internal instability and policy stagnation of its second term in office, the coalition was returned for a third term on the back of a highly negative small target strategy that made Labor's tax policies and leadership the main focus," he writes. "I've previously called this political jiu-jitsu, using your stronger opponent's own momentum to put them on the canvas." Interestingly, however, Sean Ratcliffe, Jill Shepherd and Juliet Peach test out the claims that the surprise result of the election was due to one or all of the narratives that became much discussed in the aftermath, namely that Morrison's suburban ordinariness gave him the edge over a Labor Party beholden to the inner cities, that Labor dismissed older voters to attract the younger ones, and that the ethnic vote abandoned Labor over, inter alia, its past support for same-sex marriage. They found scant evidence for these claims in the electoral data. A partial explanation for the shock result is provided by Rob Manwaring, a noted scholar of social democratic parties, who writes, "While the 2019 result was a surprise, against the backdrop of a wider decline of the electoral fortunes of the family of social democratic and Labor parties, it is probably less surprising. Much like its European counterparts, Labor's structural vote, if gauged by its first preferences, appears to be in decline. Manwaring agrees with Carol Johnson that Labor had pursued a, quote, relatively traditional social democratic strategy, but brands its suite of tax changes and spending promises as technocratic social democracy, based on specific policies rather than a sweeping view of the political economy. Now, before officially launching this, the 17th in the election series, let me propose a few brief observations about Morrison's win and his prospects. First, one lesson of the 2019 election is that asking voters to change the government is a big thing. Asking them to change the country at the same time is an even bigger ask, and that's really what Labor tried to do. If Gough Whitlam tried to do too much in office, as is the popular reduction, Shorten tried to do too much from the even weaker vantage point of opposition. Second, since winning an election everyone but Morrison and his God believed he would lose, the PM has pulled off another pretty neat trick, behaving as if the coalition is now in its first term in office. Without ever saying so, Morrison would have voters believe that the ugly, rancorous, ego-driven period of competition between the two great lions of the Liberal Party, the aforementioned Abbott and Turnbull, was another time and, frankly, another party. And to be fair in some ways, it was another party. Gough Whitlam used to say that the advantage Bob Hawke had as PM was that he didn't have to deal with Bob Hawke as ACTU leader. Similarly, Morrison has inherited a party stripped of its two biggest problems and the teams they represented. As I say, this has made things a lot easier for Morrison than the circumstances experienced by the two gentlemen mentioned. But importantly, it's also fed a perception that this is a new government rather than the pretty underwhelming, bitterly divided, frequently dysfunctional third-term affair that it's mostly been since 2013. And my final point dovetails with this, in that since COVID upended everything in the political economy, Morrison has been dealing with a novel set of problems. Not only has the meta threat seen his own approval rating soar, along with high levels of trust in government generally, but it's probably true to say that Morrison has positioned himself as the expert in pandemic economic emergency governing. As the national focal point for all the big decisions, it's simply a fact that as Prime Minister, he's also the custodian or prime custodian of the key information. Second-guessing his prescriptions, which is the most an opposition can hope to do at the moment, is at best marginal and at worst likely to be seen by voters as needlessly partisan, negative and unhelpful. In this sense, Morrison's miracle win has been followed up by Morrison's miracle prime ministership. This is not to say he's faultless or even particularly good. Rather, it is to observe the fact that his win appeared to have come from nowhere, and his agenda, likewise, has precipitated from a vacuum, taking on the form of an urgent unifying mission of national protection. Now, with that, it is my singular, somewhat unworthy honour to declare Morrison's Miracle, the 2019 Australian federal election book, duly launched, and I so do. Thank you. I'm not sure if a bottle of champagne hit something or...
Thank you very much, Mark. I think that was one of your trademark speeches, which is, as a fan, I find your work insightful, rich and also witty. And so I came along expecting to find all of those things. So I wrote that beforehand, but indeed, I think you've exceeded expectations. But I also, I think, note, and I believe the other editors would agree with me, you've introduced the comparative dimension that the editors and contributors worked so hard to include. because we believe that politics has become globalised, and phenomena such as populism, a global phenomena, as well as the links between parties here in Australia and their counterparts in the US and the UK. So there's a sort of international global political exchange process, obviously, you know, I was about to say exacerbated by social media and memes as well, and the Facebook issue which you raised. So and there are other chapters. I agree with your analysis of all the chapters, but I think there are others that I particularly liked, and I particularly liked the chapter by Michael Maley and Marian on electoral regulation, because it shows how the regulation in Australia compared with other countries is not strong enough to stop, you know, the disadvantage to minor parties and independents, that sort of free-fall spending allowed, so that's fixed. You can analyse it, but it's actually fixed by stronger regulation. So that was one of my favourite chapters, but I liked them all. And so it's not at all difficult to thank my other editors for a delightful mix of diligence and collegiality, and our contributors who were wonderful. And the collegiality of this project is based on the fact that there is a workshop just after the election, in which over a weekend, in which papers are presented, and they're picked to pieces by critical friends, some of whom are also in the audience. So it is a collegial experience for everyone, and at a time when I think academics, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, are often castigated for being insular. Now, the continuity of this enterprise is important. There have been 17 election volumes. The Academy of Social Science has sponsored 9 of those, and a number of, obviously, the current editors here and prior editors are in the room as well. So it has longevity. It has a mixture of experience and early career researchers, and looking around the room you can see who's who there. It also has a mix of methods, so it's eclectic. It promotes different methods, from qualitative research to survey work to observation of party activities and so on and so forth. So that I think is to be commended in an era of narrow specialism, to have that sort of collaboration. Now, I think there are 2 other players I want to mention, and then I have to tell you all to go to the bookshop and buy a book. But it's, you know, the continuity of this enterprise is not only based on the enthusiasm of academic staff, for whom it is a labour of love, and many hours on the weekend. I know I'd often get emails from Marian on Saturday afternoons, for example, and Anika would be first thing in the morning. So it's a 24/7 enterprise, but also to our institutions. And I think I'd like to pay particular tribute to the ANU for its support for this venture from 1996 and prior to that, when there are other election volumes not supported by the Academy. More recently, the University of Canberra has been enormously supportive for this venture in many ways. The University of Sydney has provided support over several election cycles as well. So we've been able to get support from the university hierarchies to do this work. Last but not least, I'll say something that I've always wanted to say. I'd like to thank the Academy. I'd like to thank the Academy for its enduring support, and I think most importantly, you can put a figure on the money that they've provided for the workshop last year and for the launch, but you can't really put a figure on the enthusiasm which the Academy has always brought to its involvement in this project. The real enthusiasm, I think, that's made this go so well. And we've also attempted in the volume to bear in mind, I think, the injunction of the Academy President who kicked off our workshop last year, which is that we not only need to enjoy the scholarship, we need to be aware of the impact and making an impact and ensuring that the work gets known to a wider audience. the interested reader as well. So, and I thank you all for coming and experimenting with us in our faux press club mode. We had an absolutely delightful afternoon tea. And then I'd like to ask you to, when you've finished your tea, those of us who are here, to visit the bookshop, which is just behind us over there, and browse the volume. So thank you very much.